Hey guys, tonight we stand in the flickering gloom of a small timber frame house. The year is somewhere in the 1640s, and the world outside is an immense breathing darkness. The only light spills from the stone hearth, where a low fire sends shadows dancing up the rough-hewn walls, making the familiar shapes of tools and furniture seem strange and alive. The air you breathe is thick with the scent of wood smoke, of damp wool, of the stew simmering in the iron pot over the flames. A bitter cold seeps through the cracks in the wattle and daub walls, a constant reminder of the vast, untamed wilderness that presses in on this tiny island of civilization. The wind howls a low, mournful song through the dense forest, a sound that feels older than memory itself. It's a world where every shadow could hold a meaning, and every neighbor a secret. A world where the line between prayer and spell was perilously thin. As we begin, feel free to share where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always amazing to see where our stories reach. And if you enjoy these journeys into the past, consider subscribing to join our community of sleepless historians. Now, let's dim the lights and enjoy our journey tonight. You feel the weight of the world in the quiet of this room. It is not an empty quiet, but one filled with unseen presences. You have been taught, from the moment you could understand the words of the preacher, that the physical world is a text, a story being written in real time by two authors, God and his great adversary, the devil. There are no accidents here, no random events. When the corn withers on the stalk, it is a sign. When a cow gives bloody milk, it is a message. When a child is born with a deformity, or when a sudden sickness sweeps through the village, it is a judgment, a providence sent to test your faith or punish your hidden sins. And so, you live in a state of constant, quiet vigilance, your senses tuned not just to the physical world, but to the spiritual meanings that lie just beneath its surface. You are always watching, always listening, always trying to read the clues to God's disposition, to discern whether he is pleased with you, or if his anger is kindling. You pull your rough-spun woolen shawl tighter around your shoulders, the coarse fibers scratching faintly against your skin. The fire pops, sending a brief shower of sparks up the massive central chimney, and for a moment, the room is brightly illuminated. You see the simple, hard-backed wooden chairs, the heavy trestle table, the spinning wheel silent in the corner. Your home is a fortress, not of stone, but of faith and timber. Its very structure is a metaphor for the body and the soul. The foundation is its blood, the hearth its heart, the windows its eyes, and the chimney, the breast through which the soul of the home, the fire, breathes. But even this fortress is vulnerable. Evil can creep in through the chimney, a nocturnal monster disguised as a mouse or a bird, sent to curdle the milk and sour the soul. This constant awareness of the supernatural is amplified by the very nature of your world. The nights are deeper here, the darkness more absolute than anything you knew in England. The only light comes from the hearth, or from the smoky, guttering flame of a tallow candle, which casts more shadows than it dispels. The windows are small, the glass imperfect, blurring the forest outside into a shifting, monstrous tapestry. In the profound silence of the long winter, broken only by the cry of a wolf or the sigh of the wind, every creak of the house's timber frame, every skittering sound from the thatch overhead, can feel like a message from that other world. This low hum of sensory input primes the mind, making it fertile ground for the seeds of fear. In a world of such deep quiet and profound darkness, the imagination has room to work, to populate the shadows with the demons the preacher warns of every Sabbath. The very environment conspires with your beliefs, making the spiritual world feel not just real, but tangible, immediate, and pressing in from all sides. You feel a deeper, more personal anxiety lying beneath the weight of this watchful world. It is the great, unspoken question that hums in your heart and in the heart of every Puritan. Are you saved or are you damned? You believe in predestination, the chilling doctrine that your eternal fate was decided by God before the foundation of the world, and there is nothing you can do to change it. You spend your life in a constant cycle of assurance and anxiety, searching your own heart and actions for evidence of God's grace, for some sign that you are one of the elect. But this search is a torment. 1 week, a stroke of good fortune, a healthy calf born, a successful harvest might fill you with the warm assurance of God's favor. The next, a fit of anger, a moment of envy, or a lapse in prayer can plunge you into the terrifying certainty that you are bound for hell. This is the Puritan paradox. You must live a perfectly godly life, yet you can never be certain that your godliness will save you. The preachers tell you that the soul is a feminine entity, a frail and passive thing, more easily breached by Satan than a man's. Women, they say, are the weaker vessel, more susceptible to the devil's temptations, just as Eve was in the garden. Your very nature, you are taught, makes you vulnerable. Every sin, no matter how small a flash of pride, a moment of discontent, a sharp word to a neighbor is not just a minor transgression. It is a small renunciation of God, a tiny, implicit pact with the devil. The line between a common sinner and a witch becomes perilously blurred. A witch, after all, is simply someone who has made an explicit choice to serve Satan, to formalize the pact that every sinner makes in their heart every day. And so, you examine your soul relentlessly. You fear that if your soul waits too passively for Christ, it is vulnerable to Satan's assault. Yet, if it acts too assertively, it might be seen as choosing the devil by its own volition. You are trapped, walking a razor's edge between grace and damnation, where any misstep could be your last. This profound spiritual insecurity makes the world outside your door even more threatening. The vast, dark wilderness that surrounds your small settlement is not just a forest. It is the devil's territory, a godless place where he holds dominion. The native peoples who live within it are seen not just as different, but as his agents, great witches having fellowship with the old serpent. Their healing practices a form of diabolic skill. You live in what you call a city on a hill, a tiny beacon of godliness in a sea of pagan darkness. But the darkness is always pressing in, and the devil, you are told, has singled out your community for special challenges precisely because you are God's chosen people. His favorite way of testing you is to place his own followers' witches right in your midst, disguised as amiable wives and neighbors. And so you look at the faces of the people you have known your whole life, the women you share a pew with on the Sabbath, and you cannot help but wonder which of them carries that dark secret, which of them has made that final, terrible pact. The fear is a constant, low-grade fever, a suspicion that settles like frost on the edges of your community, turning neighbor against neighbor and filling the mundane world with a quiet, creeping horror. And yet, in the face of this overwhelming uncertainty, you and your neighbors are not entirely helpless. While the ministers preach of prayer and submission to God's inscrutable will, another, older knowledge circulates in whispers, a set of practices brought over from England, passed down from one generation to the next. This is the world of folk magic, a pragmatic effort to exert some small measure of control over a life that feels utterly precarious. It is not the diabolical witchcraft the ministers condemn, but something else, a low magic of healing, protection, and divination. It is a system built on the assumption that ordinary men and women can, through simple techniques, harness the unseen forces of the world for their own ends. In the village, there are certain people known for their skill in these arts. They are called cunning folk or wise folk, and they are a vital community resource. They are not seen as witches, for the distinction is clear in the minds of most. Witches harm, but cunning folk help. If your child falls ill with a fever that the doctor cannot break, you might seek out a wise woman who knows the healing properties of local herbs and can brew a curative tea. If your cow is stolen, You might consult a cunning man who can cast his eyes upon the ground and, through some mysterious art of geomancy, tell you in which direction the thief has fled. These practitioners are often on the edge of suspicion, walking a fine line between respected healer and potential witch, but in times of crisis, their services are sought by many, even by devout church members who find the minister's prayers for patience less comforting than a tangible ritual or a protective charm. You learn some of these techniques yourself, for many do not require any special expertise. You have seen it done, this quiet act of divination. You take a common household sieve and a pair of shears. You balance the sieve carefully on the points of the blades, your heart pounding in the silence of the room. You whisper a question into the still air, a question too fraught with anxiety to speak aloud to another soul. Is your brother, his ship long overdue, still alive? You hold your breath, your eyes fixed on the sieve, waiting for it to turn or fall, for the unseen world to give you a simple, terrible answer, yes or no. Or perhaps you have heard of women like Dorcas Hoare, who owned a small, worn book of palmistry, its pages filled with rules to know what should come to pass, who could read a neighbor's future simply by studying the pattern of veins around her eyes. This desire to know the future, to lift the veil of uncertainty that Puritan theology insists upon, is a powerful and dangerous temptation. It is a way of seeking the knowledge that God keeps for himself, a small rebellion against the endless anxiety of not knowing your fate. You also learn the arts of protection, the small rituals of countermagic meant to guard your home and your family from the malevolent forces that lurk just outside the door. These practices are so deeply ingrained in the culture you brought from England that even the most pious find themselves resorting to them in times of fear. You nail an iron horseshoe over your doorway, its ends pointing up to keep the luck from spilling out. With a knife, you carefully carve a hexafoil, a daisy wheel of 6 interlocking petals, into the heavy oak beam above your hearth, an ancient symbol to ward off evil spirits. These are acts of hope, small fortifications against a hostile world. But some magic is more aggressive. When you suspect a neighbor of witchcraft, when you believe their envy or malice has caused your child to sicken or your livestock to die, there are ways to fight back. You can perform a ritual of sympathetic magic, a way of turning the witch's power back upon them. You might take a lock of your sick child's hair or the tail of a bewitched animal and burn it in the fire, believing that as the object is destroyed, the spell will be broken and the harm will recoil upon its sender. The most powerful and feared form of this counter-magic is the creation of a witch bottle. You take a small stoneware or glass bottle, perhaps a medicine vial, and into it you place sharp personal things, bent pins, rusty nails, thorns, and, most importantly, your own urine, which is believed to contain your essence, and thus the imprint of the witch's spell. You seal the bottle tightly and bury it, often upside down, beneath your hearth, the very heart of your home. The belief is that the sharp objects inside will torment the witch, piercing and pinching their spectral body, causing them such agony that they will be forced to lift the curse. It is a desperate, violent act, born of terror and a desire for justice. The ministers condemn such practices as diabolical, a form of magic no different from a witch's spell. But in the dark of night, when you hear your child crying out in a fevered dream, the abstract theology of the meeting house feels very far away. What feels real is the cool glass of the bottle in your hand, the sharp glint of the pins, and the fierce, protective hope that this small, buried object can keep your family safe. You find yourself in the year 1647 as a sickness comes to the town of Windsor in the Connecticut colony. It is not a common cold or a passing fever. It is a pestilence, an influenza that sweeps through the small, timber frame houses like a phantom, leaving grief in its wake. You watch as the death rate in the town quadruples. No one seems to be spared from the fear. The children of the minister, John Warham, are taken. The child of the town doctor, Ray Rossiter, dies. There seems to be no reason, no logic to it. It is a time of immense and inexplicable trauma. A communal wound that festers with questions that have no answers. In a world where nothing happens by accident, who is to blame for this? Whose sin has brought God's wrath down upon Windsor? Or is it something else? Is it the devil's work? You live on a small lane called Backer Row, a collection of modest homes nestled near the Farmington River. Your days are filled with the sounds of mourning. From the house next door, the home of Thomas and Ann Thornton, the cries are almost constant. They have lost 4 of their children to the sickness. You see their small bodies carried out, wrapped in linen, and your own heart constricts with a fear so profound it is almost a physical pain. You pray, you search your own soul for some hidden corruption that might have invited this plague, but the sickness continues its relentless march. And then, in the midst of this shared misery, you begin to notice something. You look across the muddy lane to the house of John and Alse Young. They are quiet people, English folk like yourself, who came to this new world seeking a better life. But there is a strangeness about them that you cannot quite name. While your neighbors are burying their children, Alse Young's house remains untouched by the deepest sorrow. You see her daughter, also named Alice, a girl of about 7, playing near the doorway, her cheeks rosy with health. You hear no sounds of racking coughs from within their home, see no doctor coming and going with a grim face. And a question, like a poisonous seed, begins to sprout in the dark soil of your fear. Why them? Why are they spared when so many others suffer? You hear the whispers begin, quiet as the rustle of dry leaves. They pass from one neighbor to another over a shared fence, in the hushed tones of the meeting house after the Sabbath service. Someone remembers that Alse is only one child. In a community where large families are the norm, a sign of God's blessing, her single daughter now seems unnatural, a statistical anomaly that demands explanation. Could it be jealousy? Could a woman so barren be filled with a secret malice toward her more fertile neighbors? The thought is ugly, but in the grip of grief and terror, it takes root. The community's gaze, once diffuse with shared suffering, begins to narrow, to focus, to seek a single point on which to lay its unbearable burden of pain. That point becomes Alse Young. You never learn who made the first formal accusation. You never know what specific act of maleficium she was charged with. The historical record is almost entirely silent, which is a kind of terror in itself. All that remains for you to hear are the chillingly brief, dispassionate entries in 2 different journals written by 2 different men of authority. The first, by Massachusetts Bay Governor John Winthrop, notes simply, 1. Of Windsor arraigned and executed at Hartford for a witch. The second, in the diary of Windsor's town clerk Matthew Grant, is even more stark. On the page for May 26, 1647, he writes just 4 words, Alse Young was hanged. And with that, the silence of the past falls, leaving you to imagine the fear in her eyes, the confusion, the pleas of innocence that were never recorded, swallowed by the verdict of a community desperate for a scapegoat. Her case establishes the deadly template for what is to come. A community suffers an inexplicable trauma, and in its desperate search for meaning, it finds a vulnerable woman and calls her a witch. Just 1 year later, in the year 1648, you feel the fear migrate north to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, to the bustling port town of Charlestown, a settlement of merchants and shipbuilders just across the river from Boston. Here, you encounter a woman named Margaret Jones. She is not a shadowy outcast, but a well-known figure in the community, a healer and a midwife. You have seen her yourself, a comforting presence moving through the town, her hands skilled in bringing new life into the world and in soothing the sick with her remedies. She carries with her the scent of aniseed and other herbs, the tools of a physician in a time when formal doctors are few and their cures often brutal. Her knowledge of the body, of plants of healing, gives her a certain power, a standing in the community built on her ability to ease suffering. But you know that in this world, a woman's power is a dangerous thing. It is a power that exists outside the formal structures of the church and the state, which are controlled entirely by men. And soon, you see how the very things that make Margaret a valued healer become the source of suspicion against her. Her touch, which once soothed, is now perceived as malignant. A patient she strokes with affection is suddenly taken with deafness or violent vomiting. Her medicines, which she herself confesses are harmless things, simple liquors and seeds, begin to have extraordinary violent effects in the bodies of those who take them. You see the narrative around her begin to shift. Her successes are forgotten, and her failures are magnified, reinterpreted through a lens of fear. The whispers grow louder when she quarrels with a neighbor. You hear the story passed from one person to the next. Just days after their angry words, the neighbor's cattle fell mysteriously ill. It is a classic sign, a story straight from the witch-hunting manuals of England. Her knowledge of healing now seems sinister, her ability to predict the course of an illness uncanny. She warns a man who refuses to take her physic that he will never be healed. And sure enough, his ailment lingers, defying the efforts of all other physicians and surgeons. What was once seen as skill is now seen as a curse. The community's trust in her curdles into suspicion. The healer is becoming the witch. Her knowledge is no longer a comfort. It is a threat. Her power is no longer seen as a gift for healing, but as a diabolical weapon for causing harm. You watch as the men of the colony move to reclaim a power they feel is not rightfully hers. The accusations against Margaret Jones are brought before the general court, and you hear that the magistrates decide to employ a new and terrifying method of investigation, one recently imported from the witch hunts of England. It is a technique prescribed by the self-proclaimed witch finder general, Matthew Hopkins, in his infamous manual, and it is called watching. You understand it is not a process of discovery, but a ritual of confirmation, a form of psychological torture designed to produce the very evidence it claims to seek. You hear the stories of what happens to Margaret next, and the news from the Boston jail chills you. You learn that she is taken from her home, separated from her husband Thomas, who has also been accused, and confined to a small, cold room. You hear that the court has ordered a strict watch be set about her every night. You try to imagine the ordeal, the way they force her to sit on a stool in the middle of the room, her legs crossed, forbidden to move, forbidden to sleep. For 24 hours, the eyes of the watchers are upon her, unblinking. They are not there to protect her. They are there to wait for her imp, her familiar, the small demonic creature that they believe serves her, to come and feed from a secret teat on her body. The hours crawl by, or so the story goes. The darkness of the cell is broken only by a sliver of light from a lantern. The silence is heavy, punctuated by the shuffling feet of the watchers. You can only guess at the cruel magic that sleep deprivation works on a mind blurred by exhaustion and terror. The walls of the room must seem to breathe, the shadows twisting into monstrous shapes. The watchers, too, must be tired, their own senses strained and unreliable. And then the news spreads, recorded by Governor Winthrop himself, that in the clear daylight, one of the watchers saw it. He claims to have seen a little child in her arms as she sat on the floor. He says that when he moved toward her, the child ran into another room and vanished into thin air. It does not matter if it was a hallucination, born of his own exhaustion, a trick of the light, a lie. It is now evidence. It is now proof. The ordeal, you learn, is not over. Next comes the physical search. You hear how she is stripped and examined by a jury of women from her own community. Their hands, once familiar and friendly, are now cold and clinical as they search her body for the witch's mark. They find what they are looking for, an apparent teat in her secret parts, which they describe as being as fresh as if it had been newly sucked. This discovery is the final damning piece of physical proof. The closed loop of logic is complete. The process of watching has created the very phenomenon it was designed to find, turning sleep-deprived visions and natural marks on the body into irrefutable evidence of a pact with the devil. She is no longer Margaret Jones, the midwife from Charlestown. She is a convicted witch, her fate sealed not by her actions, but by the fears and fantasies of the men who watch her from the doorway. You hear the sentence is passed. She is to be hanged. On June 15th, 1648, you might be one of the crowd that watches as she is led to the gallows on Boston Neck, a narrow strip of land connecting the peninsula to the mainland. A young John Alse, the son of a minister, is there, a boy of 12 who will one day become a minister himself and play his own part in a future, greater tragedy. You see him and his neighbors take pains to bring her to confession, not to save her life, but to save her soul. But she refuses. She maintains her innocence to the end. And then, at the very same day and hour that she is executed, a great tempest, a furious storm, strikes the colony of Connecticut, miles to the south. It is a violent, unnatural storm, a tornado, the first ever recorded in the region. To you and the people of Massachusetts Bay, this is no coincidence. It is the final, terrifying punctuation mark on her story. It is God himself, or perhaps the devil, offering a supernatural confirmation of the court's judgment. The legal process does not end in the courtroom. It extends into the natural world, where every clap of thunder, every bolt of lightning, can be read as a divine signature on a death warrant. The story does not even end with her death. You hear that her husband Thomas, released from prison, tries to flee the colony. He books passage on a ship called the Welcome, bound for Barbados. But the ship, though heavily loaded with cargo and horses, begins to rock and pitch unnaturally in the calm harbor. The crew grows fearful. The captain quarrels with Thomas, and soon the word spreads through the ship. The husband of an executed witch is on board. He is arrested and dragged from the vessel. And as the story is later told, the moment he is removed, the ship immediately rights itself and sits steady in the water. Her ghost, it seems, still lingers, a final whispered testament to the power of your community's belief to shape reality itself. For a time, the fear seems to subside. But 15 years later, in 1662, it erupts again with even greater force, back in the colony of Connecticut, in the town of Hartford. This time, it will not be a single case, but a full-blown panic, the largest and most terrifying witch hunt you have yet seen, a grim dress rehearsal for the catastrophe that will one day engulf Salem. It begins, as it so often does, with the suffering of a child. It is late March, and inside the home of John and Bethia Kelly, their 8-year-old daughter Elizabeth is in the throes of a violent and inexplicable illness. She had been perfectly healthy just days before, after returning home from a visit with a neighbor, a woman known only as Goodwife Ayres. Now, she writhes in her bed, her small body convulsing. Her parents listen, their hearts frozen with terror, as their daughter cries out in a voice thin with pain, "Father, Father, help me, help me. Goodwife Ayres is upon me. She chokes me. She kneels on my belly. She will break my bowels. She pinches me. She will make me black and blue." You learn that little Elizabeth Kelly does not survive. After her death, the seed of accusation she planted begins to germinate in the fertile ground of Hartford's fear. Shortly thereafter, another young woman in the town, Anne Cole, is taken with strange fits. She shakes violently, her body contorting into unnatural positions. Blasphemous words pour from her lips, words that the horrified onlookers believe are not her own, but are spoken by the devil, making use of her tongue. When she is lucid, she points a trembling finger at her neighbor, a woman named Rebecca Greensmith, and blames her for the torment. The pattern has begun. The affliction is spreading. What might have been dismissed as an isolated tragedy is now becoming a contagion of fear. You see, the accusations that follow become a tapestry woven from your Puritan anxieties and European folklore. One afflicted person claims that Satan has caused her to speak with a Dutch accent, a bizarre manifestation of your anxieties about outsiders and foreign influences. An eyewitness swears they saw their neighbors transform into large black hounds in the dead of night. Several people come forward to claim they have seen witches dancing with the devil in the woods, a classic image of the witches' Sabbath imported to the New England wilderness. The supernatural is no longer a distant theological concept. It is a terrifying, immediate reality, erupting in your homes and in your very bodies. The community is gripped by a panic that feels as real and as deadly as any plague. The accusations do not follow a simple, linear path. They spiral outwards, ensnaring more and more people in a complex web of fear, suspicion, and pre-existing social tensions. You know, Rebecca Greensmith, the first target, is a vulnerable one, described by a contemporary as a lewd, ignorant, considerably aged woman. She is already on the margins of society, making her an easy scapegoat, but the accusations soon become a tool for others. The husband of Goodwife Ayres, the first woman named by the dying Elizabeth Kelly, perhaps in a desperate attempt to deflect suspicion from his own wife, joins the chorus of those accusing Rebecca Greensmith. It is a chilling example of the self-preservationist logic that takes hold in a community consumed by fear. Accuse or be accused. Then, under the pressure of interrogation, Rebecca Greensmith does something that changes the entire dynamic of the panic. She confesses, but she does not just confess for herself. She implicates others. She names her own husband, Nathaniel, as a witch, and she describes a coven, a secret society of evil, operating within the community. She tells the magistrates that she met in the woods with 7 other witches, including the now-fled Goody Ayres, a woman named Mary Sanford, and another named Elizabeth Seeger. Suddenly, the threat is no longer a few isolated, malevolent individuals. It is an organized conspiracy, a hidden army of Satan's soldiers living among you. The fear escalates exponentially. Neighbors begin to testify against neighbors, dredging up old suspicions. They recall seeing Elizabeth Seeger dancing in the woods with other women, cooking mysterious concoctions in black kettles. The witch hunt is no longer just about identifying a single source of evil. It has become a chaotic and brutal process of social purging, a way for the community to lance the boil of all its festering resentments and anxieties, projecting them onto a growing list of accused witches. Rebecca Greensmith's confession, likely delivered in a state of terror and confusion in open court, provides your community with the narrative it seems to be unconsciously seeking. It is a lurid and terrifying story that confirms your deepest fears, a tale woven from the threads of English folklore and Puritan theology. She admits, they say, to having familiarity with the devil. This is the ultimate transgression, the willing surrender of a Christian soul to the enemy of God. She speaks of a planned gathering, a merry meeting to be held at Christmas, where the coven would formalize their pact with Satan. To your Puritan mind, this is a grotesque parody of your own sacred covenants, an inversion of all that is holy. It is the ultimate act of social and spiritual treason. Through her words, or perhaps through the leading questions of her interrogators, a vivid picture of a New England witch's Sabbath emerges. You can almost see it, following her spectral self as she slips out of her house in the dead of night, leaving her sleeping husband behind. You follow her into the deep, dark woods that border the town, a place that has always felt like the edge of the known world, the beginning of the devil's domain. There, in a moonlit clearing, she meets with the others. They are the faces of her neighbors, transformed by the darkness into something monstrous. They dance, not in the joyful, communal way of an English country fair, but with a wild, demonic energy. They perform secret rituals, their whispers lost in the sound of the wind through the pines. They are the nocturnal monsters the ministers have always warned of, amiable wives and mothers by day, but servants of chaos and mayhem by night, inverting every cherished ideal of piety, motherhood, and neighborliness. It is a story that gives shape and form to the formless anxieties of the community. It is almost certainly not a factual account of real events, but rather a co-created narrative, a story told by the community through the mouth of a terrified woman. You can guess that the magistrates, steeped in the literature of European witch hunts, likely asked leading questions. Did you meet in the woods? Did you dance with the devil? Who else was there? And Rebecca, an ignorant and aged woman, under immense psychological duress, gave them the answers they wanted to hear. The story that would make sense of the chaos. The story that would perhaps save her from further torment by confirming their darkest suspicions. Her confession is not a window into a secret world of witchcraft. It is a mirror reflecting the shared, collective nightmare of your Puritan community. A nightmare that is about to be made real by the power of the court. You witness how the confession of Rebecca Greensmith unleashes the final, deadly phase of the Hartford witch panic. With this seemingly irrefutable proof of a diabolical conspiracy, the court moves swiftly. Rebecca and her husband Nathaniel, who protests his innocence to the end, are tried and found guilty. They are indicted for not having the fear of God before thine eyes, and for having entertained familiarity with Satan. The verdict is death. Mary Sanford, another woman named in Rebecca's confession, is also condemned. Along with a fourth individual, Mary Barnes of the nearby town of Farmington, they are led to the gallows and executed. 4 lives are extinguished in an attempt to purge the community of its fear, and for a time, it seems to work. The records note that after the executions, Ann Cole, the young woman whose fits had fueled the panic, was restored to health. The purge appears to have been successful. The devil has been driven back. But at this critical moment, you see a new force enter the narrative, the rational skepticism of a man in power. The governor of the Connecticut colony, John Winthrop, Jr., is not a typical Puritan magistrate. He is a man of science as well as a man of faith, an alchemist and a physician who is deeply interested in the natural world. Unlike the local officials who have been swept up in the hysteria, you see Governor Winthrop begin to question the very foundation of the trials. He looks at the evidence being presented, the spectral visions, the coerced confessions, the tales of dancing in the woods, and he is not convinced. His intervention is decisive and transformative. He begins to impose a more rigorous standard of proof on the courts. He establishes new rules of evidence, insisting that there must be at least 2 credible witnesses for each alleged act of witchcraft. Most importantly, he challenges and ultimately dismisses the use of spectral evidence, the unprovable testimony of visions and dreams that has been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. He uses his authority to overturn the conviction of Elizabeth Seeger, who had been found guilty based on such flimsy evidence. Because of the governor's intervention, the engine of the witch hunt sputters and dies. The accusations lose their power when they are no longer validated by the highest authority in the colony. The panic subsides. Order is restored to Connecticut not by the hangman's noose, but by the application of reason and legal restraint. These 4 executions in 1662 are the last for witchcraft in Connecticut's history. Winthrop's skepticism provides a crucial firebreak, demonstrating that these panics are not unstoppable forces of nature. They can be contained and extinguished by the courageous choices of those in authority. His actions stand in stark contrast to what will happen 30 years later in Massachusetts, where the authorities, faced with a similar crisis, will choose the path of credulity, leading to a disaster that Winthrop's wisdom had already shown was entirely preventable. In the years that follow the Hartford Panic, you experience a period of relative quiet on the witchcraft front, but the ground is being sown with the seeds of a future more terrible harvest. In 1675, a conflict erupts that will forever scar your New England psyche. It is a conflict you will come to know as King Philip's War, and it is the most devastating and brutal war in American history, measured per capita. An alliance of Native American tribes, led by the Wampanoag sachem Metacom, whom the English call Philip, rises up against the colonists. For over a year, New England is plunged into a firestorm of violence. Towns are burned, settlements are abandoned, and the casualties on both sides are immense. For you and your fellow Puritans, this is not merely a war over land or resources. It is an apocalyptic struggle against the forces of darkness. You have long viewed the untamed wilderness as the devil's last bastion on earth, and the native peoples as his willing servants, great witches and diabolic skill, users who consort with infernal spirits. The war crystallizes this theological belief into a terrifying, bloody reality. The enemy you face is not just human, it is explicitly demonic. The attacks are seen as a direct assault by Satan himself, an attempt to destroy your city on a hill and reclaim the land for his dark kingdom. The war leaves a deep and lasting trauma on the generation of children who lived through it. The northern frontier, in what is now Maine and New Hampshire, is particularly ravaged. Refugees, many of them orphaned and having witnessed unimaginable violence, flood into the safer towns of Essex County, including the area around Salem. These children have seen their homes burned, their families killed. They have lived in a state of constant terror, where the threat of a sudden, violent attack was a daily reality. This experience is filtered through the lens of your culture's beliefs. They were not just attacked by warriors, they were attacked by the agents of the devil. This connection between the trauma of the war and the future witch hunt is crucial. Many of the young women who will become the afflicted girls of Salem in 1692 are these very same refugees. They are the survivors of King Philip's War. When they begin to have their fits 16 years later, their symptoms are a chilling echo of their childhood trauma. They cry out that they are being pinched, choked, and tormented by unseen forces. They are, in a very real sense, reliving the horrors they endured as children. But now, the enemy is different. They are no longer seeing native warriors in the forest. They are seeing the specters of their own neighbors in the meeting house. The Salem witch hunt can be understood in part as a massive communal manifestation of post-traumatic stress, a displaced reenactment of the war. It is a desperate attempt by a traumatized society to finally confront and defeat a supernatural evil that they believed had almost destroyed them once before, this time projecting the faces of their old enemies onto the new faces of their neighbors. 4 years before the storm breaks in Salem, you hear of a prelude to the tragedy playing out in Boston in 1688. You learn of the case of an elderly woman named Anne Glover, known to her neighbors as Goody Glover, and her story is a microcosm of the forces of prejudice, fear, and miscommunication that will soon tear Salem apart. Goody Glover is an outsider in every conceivable way in the rigid, homogeneous world of Puritan Boston. She is old, she is poor, she is Irish, and most damningly, she is a devout Roman Catholic. She had been deported from Ireland years before by Oliver Cromwell's forces and sent to Barbados, where her husband died for his faith. Now a widow, she lives with her daughter and works as a housekeeper for the family of a local mason, John Goodwin. The trouble begins, as it so often does, with a small domestic dispute. The Goodwins' eldest daughter, 13-year-old Martha, accuses Goody Glover's daughter of stealing some linen from the laundry. The elderly Glover, described as a scandalous old woman, leaps to her daughter's defense and bestowed very bad language upon the girl. Shortly after this argument, Martha and 3 of her siblings begin to suffer from strange afflictions. Their symptoms are dramatic and terrifying, a preview of what is to come in Salem. They have fits, they contort their bodies, they bark like dogs, and they complain of being tormented by an invisible force. The case attracts the attention of one of the most influential men in the colony, the minister Cotton Mather. Mather, a brilliant but zealous man, is fascinated by the workings of the invisible world and has already published on the subject of witchcraft. He takes one of the Goodwin children into his own home for observation, documenting the case with scholarly precision. He becomes convinced that the children are bewitched and that Goody Glover is the witch. At her trial, Goody Glover is trapped in a nightmare of cultural and linguistic confusion. Her native language is Gaelic. She understands English, but cannot speak it fluently, and under the stress of interrogation, she reverts to her mother tongue. The Puritan magistrates, unable to understand her, at first believe she is speaking the language of the devil. When she tries to recite the Lord's Prayer, she can only do so in Gaelic and broken Latin. Her inability to say it perfectly in English is taken as a sign of guilt. Her Catholic faith becomes damning evidence against her. When she speaks of praying to her, saints, or spirits, the same word in Gaelic Mather interprets this as an admission of communing with demons. The small, crude dolls found in her possession, which may have been nothing more than humble Catholic icons, are seen as puppets, tools of image magic used to torment her victims. Despite a local merchant named Robert Taliff speaking out, calling her a despised, crazy, poor old woman, and the proof against her wholly deficient, she is convicted. On November 16, 1688, Anne Glover is hanged on Boston Common, the first person executed for witchcraft in Massachusetts in 32 years. Her case, and Cotton Mather's widely read account of it, Memorable Providences, becomes a sensation. It does not just report on a witch trial. It provides a terrifyingly detailed and authoritative script for how a witch hunt unfolds, a script that will be followed with devastating consequences just 4 years later. To understand how the whispers in the Paris household could escalate into a legal catastrophe that would consume an entire county, you must first understand a single devastating legal concept: spectral evidence. It is an idea that will transform the Salem courtrooms from places of law into theaters of the supernatural, and it will be the engine that drives the deadliest witch hunt in American history. The concept itself is born from your belief in the invisible world. A witch, you believe, could project their spirit or specter out of their physical body to do harm. So, a person could be sitting in their own home, miles away from their victim, while their spectral shape appeared to them in a dream or a vision, pinching them, choking them, or tormenting them into signing the devil's book. The testimony of a victim who claimed to have seen and been assaulted by a specter was known as spectral evidence. The crucial and fatal question was a theological one. Could the devil assume the shape of an innocent person to do his evil work? Throughout most of New England's history, and in English law, the answer was a cautious yes. The devil was a deceiver, after all. Therefore, while spectral evidence might be grounds for suspicion, it was considered too unreliable to be the basis for a conviction. You know that Governor John Winthrop, Jr. had recognized this danger and dismissed its use in Hartford 30 years earlier. But in 1692, the Special Court of Oyer and Terminer, established to handle the Salem cases, and led by the unyielding Chief Magistrate William Stoughton, made a different and catastrophic decision. They ruled that the devil could not use a person's shape without their consent. This single legal interpretation changed everything. It meant that if an afflicted girl cried out in court that she saw the specter of, say, Rebecca Nurse attacking her, that vision was now accepted as irrefutable proof that Rebecca Nurse had made a pact with the devil and given him permission to use her form. The result is a legal nightmare from which there is no escape. The evidence against you is now entirely subjective, a vision that exists only in the mind of your accuser. It is invisible to the judges, the jury, and everyone else in the crowded meeting house. How can you defend yourself against a crime that no one saw you commit in a place you never were? How can you prove that your specter was not tormenting someone in a dream last night? It is impossible. The burden of proof is inverted. The court is no longer required to prove your guilt. You are now required to disprove an unprovable claim. The legal system, meant to be a shield for the innocent, has been transformed into a weapon for the accusers. The fears and fantasies of a few young women, validated by the highest court in the colony, now hold the power of life and death. You feel the air in Massachusetts in the years, just before 1692, become thin and brittle with anxiety. You feel as if your colony is perched on the edge of a precipice, besieged from without and rotting from within. It is a perfect storm of converging crises, a society under a pressure so immense that it is beginning to crack. The political landscape is one of chaos and uncertainty. The original colonial charter, the very foundation of your government, had been revoked by the English crown. The royally appointed governor, Sir Edmund Andros, was so unpopular that he was overthrown in a popular revolt, leaving the colony in a state of legal limbo, a vacuum of legitimate authority. There is a deep and gnawing fear of punishment from England, a sense that your city on a hill is losing its divinely ordained independence. Socially and economically, the tensions are just as high. The old Puritan dream of a society of self-sufficient farmsteads is fraying. Land, once seemingly limitless, is becoming scarce, leading to bitter disputes between neighbors and between generations. A deep rift is growing between the traditional, agrarian world of inland farming communities like Salem village and the increasingly commercial, prosperous, and worldly culture of the port towns like Salem town. You and the other people of the village feel your pious way of life is being threatened by the capitalist ambitions of the town, and this resentment poisons your interactions. On top of this, the world feels physically hostile. The trauma of King Philip's War still lingers, a raw wound in the collective memory, and skirmishes with native tribes on the frontier continue to flare up. Outbreaks of smallpox sweep through the towns, a terrifying and inexplicable disease that leaves death and disfigurement in its wake. Even the weather seems to have turned against you. This period is part of what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, a time of brutally cold winters and harsh, unpredictable seasons that make farming even more precarious. And within the communities themselves, particularly in Salem Village, the social fabric is tearing apart. The village is racked by bitter factionalism, with families pitted against one another in disputes over land, property, and church politics. The powerful Putnam family and their allies are locked in a feud with the rival Porter family. The village cannot agree on a minister, leading to protracted and ugly disputes that see men like James Bailey and George Burroughs driven out of town. The community is not a harmonious body of saints. It is a cauldron of envy, rivalry, and discord. Faced with this overwhelming combination of political instability, economic anxiety, social strife, and physical hardship, your Puritan worldview has only one all-encompassing explanation. This cannot be a series of unrelated misfortunes. This must be a coordinated, strategic assault by the devil himself, a grand plot to destroy your holy commonwealth. The idea of a widespread witchcraft conspiracy is not just a product of religious fanaticism. It is a desperate attempt to find a single, unifying narrative that can make sense of a world that has spiraled into chaos. The witch hunt is about to become the terrible, logical endpoint of all these intersecting fears. The moment when the community turns inward to purge the evil they believe is the source of all their suffering. The journey ends where the great tragedy begins. You are in the parsonage of Salem Village, in the home of its contentious minister, the Reverend Samuel Parris. It is the winter of 1691 and 1692, a season of deep cold and oppressive quiet. The world outside is muffled by snow. The landscape a stark canvas of white and gray. Inside the house, the air is heavy with the scent of wood smoke and the palpable tension of a divided community. For the young girls who live here, Paris's 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams' life is a monotonous cycle of chores, prayers, and catechisms. It is a world of immense spiritual pressure and profound boredom, a life of drudgery and fear of hell. Perhaps to pass the long, dark hours, they engage in a bit of harmless folk magic, a practice common among young girls of the time. With the minister's slave, Tidaba, who has brought her own stories and beliefs from the Caribbean, they might try a bit of divination, turning a sieve with a key, or dropping an egg white into a glass of water, trying to conjure the image of their future husbands. It is a game, a way to peer into a future that seems impossibly distant. But it is a forbidden game, a small act of conjuration that plants a seed of guilt and fear in their young minds. Then, in the cold heart of January, it begins. Betty Paris falls ill, but it is a strange illness. She doesn't just have a fever. She dashes about the room, dives under furniture. Her body contorts into painful, unnatural shapes. Soon, Abigail begins to exhibit the same terrifying symptoms. Reverend Paris is frantic. He prays, he fasts, but the affliction only worsens. He calls for the local physician, Dr. William Griggs. You can imagine the scene. The doctor in the dim, firelit room, bending over the writhing form of the young girl. He is a man of medicine, but his knowledge is limited. He examines her. He listens to the minister's desperate account, and he can find no natural cause for her suffering. He has no name for this disease in his medical books. And so, he reaches for the only other explanation his culture can provide. He looks at Reverend Paris, and in the oppressive quiet of the sick room, he utters the fateful diagnosis. The girls, he says, are under an evil hand. The words hang in the cold air, heavy with all the fear and suspicion of the past 50 years. They are not just a diagnosis. They are an accusation. They are the spark that will ignite the dry tinder of Salem's anxieties into a raging fire. The whispers that have haunted the edges of New England life for decades. The whispers that condemned Alse Young and Margaret Jones. The whispers that echoed through the Hartford Panic and the home of Goody Glover are about to become a roar. The last quiet winter is over. The trials are about to begin. And so, the story that began in the flickering firelight of a single home returns to one. The images of that cold, fearful room beginning to soften and recede. The scent of wood smoke fades from the air, and the sound of the winter wind howling outside the small, imperfect window grows distant, replaced by the quiet hum of your own time, in your own safe and warm space. The weight of that other world, a world so heavy with unseen meaning and unspoken fear, begins to lift, its sharp edges blurring as sleep gently pulls you away from the past. The gallows hills are quiet now, covered in grass and the patient dust of centuries. The small, unmarked graves of the accused have been lost to the soil, their stories absorbed back into the land they once walked. The terror that gripped a generation has long since passed, leaving behind only the silence and the faint, indelible stain on the pages of history. And in the quiet that followed the last verdict, after the last cell was emptied, the snows of another winter came, and another, blanketing the fields and the forests, covering the footprints of the accusers and the accused alike, covering the fear, until all that was left was the story, a whispered warning carried on the wind, for us to hear tonight.